May 3, 1944. Adolf Hitler stood in the map room of the Berghof, his mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps, studying intelligence reports spread across the wooden table. Outside, spring sunshine illuminated the peaks of the Obersalzberg. Inside, the Führer's hands moved across documents detailing troop concentrations, supply movements, and aerial reconnaissance photographs of southern England. Everything, by every measure his intelligence services reported, suggested the Allied invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais. The shortest route across the Channel. The most logical choice. The most obvious target. Then Colonel Friedrich Adolf Krummacher, his Wehrmacht operations officer, entered with a folder marked Fortitude, latest assessments. Hitler opened it, scanned the first page, and his finger stopped on a single line. Estimated total Allied ground forces in Britain, 1.9 to 2.1 million men. He read it again. His face, according to officers present in the room, didn't change expression immediately. He simply stared at the number, his right hand beginning that slight tremor that appeared when he was under stress, then forced himself still. For 4 years since the fall of France, Hitler had built a narrative. The British were broken, clinging to their island, dependent on American aid. The invasion, when it came, would be a desperate gamble, a single thrust that German forces could identify, isolate, and destroy at the waterline. The Atlantic Wall, 50 divisions, seasoned troops, fortified positions from Norway to Spain. Everything was prepared. Everything was in place. And now here, in this folder compiled from prisoner interrogations, resistance reports, and Luftwaffe reconnaissance, was a number that suggested something different. Not a desperate gamble. A massive, methodical build-up. An invasion force larger than anything Germany had assembled for the entire Eastern Front. 2 million men, Hitler said quietly. His staff officers shifted. General Alfred Jodl, chief of the Wehrmacht operations staff, stepped closer. Mein Führer, our analysts believe many of these formations are part of the deception. The fictitious 1st United States Army Group under Patton, are they fictitious? Hitler's voice cut across the room. Or are they simply positioned where we cannot see them? No one answered. The intelligence was contradictory, deliberately so. The Allies were running the most sophisticated deception operation in military history, Operation Fortitude, designed to convince Germany the invasion would strike at Pas-de-Calais while the actual landing came elsewhere. But deception required some truth. You couldn't fake 2 million men. You couldn't fabricate the Liberty ships crossing the Atlantic, the mountains of supplies photographed at British ports, the tank parks and airfields and ammunition dumps. Somewhere in England, a genuine army was gathering. The question was where it would strike. Hitler turned to the wall map of northwestern Europe, his eyes moving from Calais to Normandy to Brittany. For months, he had insisted the invasion would come at Calais. It was the obvious choice, geographically sound, strategically logical. His generals agreed. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of forces in the west, had positioned the strongest defenses there. The 15th Army, the best equipped and most heavily reinforced, held the Calais sector. But lately, Hitler had begun to doubt. Not publicly, not in formal conferences, but in private conversations, in moments of intuition that his staff had learned never to dismiss entirely. He had mentioned Normandy, the Cotentin Peninsula, Cherbourg as a port objective. His generals had nodded politely and continued planning for Calais. Now, staring at the intelligence estimate, Hitler felt something shift in his understanding. If the Allies had 2 million men in Britain, they weren't planning a single thrust. They were planning an operation so large it could overwhelm German defenses through sheer mass. And if that were true, then perhaps Calais was exactly where they wanted Germany to expect them. Perhaps the deception wasn't about hiding weakness. Perhaps it was about disguising where overwhelming strength would fall. Before we continue, if you're finding this deep dive into World War II decision-making valuable, consider subscribing. There's more to this story than you might expect, and it gets considerably darker. To understand what Hitler was facing in May 1944, you have to understand what he believed about Allied capabilities, and more importantly, where those beliefs came from. Since 1940, German intelligence on Britain had been catastrophically compromised, but Hitler didn't fully know this. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, had been penetrated and partially turned by British counterintelligence. Many of its agents in Britain were actually double agents working for MI5 under the double-cross system. They sent carefully crafted reports back to Germany, reports that seemed credible, that contained enough truth to be believable, but that systematically reinforced exactly the assumptions the Allies wanted Germany to hold. Hitler received daily intelligence briefings. Each morning, summaries crossed his desk detailing Allied troop movements, equipment production, strategic intentions. Much of it was accurate. American war production was staggering. Liberty ships were being built in days. Bomber command was growing stronger. The 8th Air Force was hammering German cities. But the crucial details, the locations of specific divisions, the timing of operations, the actual invasion target, these were poisoned. The intelligence said Patton commanded the largest Allied army group. It did, on paper, but that army group was largely fictitious, an elaborate deception complete with fake radio traffic, dummy tanks, and false supply depots. The intelligence said the invasion force was concentrated in southeastern England, opposite Calais. Some of it was, but the actual assault divisions were marshalling in southwestern England, opposite Normandy. Hitler studied these reports in his map room, on the walls of which hung detailed charts of the Atlantic Wall defenses. 50 divisions stretched along the coast, from Norway through France to Spain. It looked formidable. In places, it was formidable. Massive concrete bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, beach obstacles, minefields, artillery positioned to turn landing beaches into killing zones. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, given command of Army Group B in early 1944, had thrown himself into strengthening these defenses. He had studied the problem of amphibious invasion and concluded the Allies must be stopped at the waterline. Once they got tanks and artillery ashore, once they established a lodgment, German forces wouldn't have the mobility or air superiority to push them back. So Rommel built. His engineers planted millions of mines, constructed thousands of beach obstacles, poured concrete for gun emplacements. He wanted panzer divisions positioned close to the coast, ready to counterattack within hours. But he didn't control the panzers. Hitler did. And Hitler, influenced by von Rundstedt's more conventional thinking, kept the armored reserve inland, positioned to respond once the invasion's objective became clear. This was the crucial flaw in German defensive planning. They were preparing to react, not to prevent. They would identify the invasion, determine if it was the real assault or a feint, then commit their mobile reserves. It was doctrinally sound. It was what military theory prescribed. It assumed Germany would have time to identify, decide, and react. But the number in Krummeker's folder suggested time was exactly what Germany wouldn't have. 2 million men meant the Allies could assault multiple beaches simultaneously, could establish a lodgment faster than Germany could concentrate forces, could achieve in hours what German planning assumed would take days. Hitler stood at his map, his finger tracing the coastline. He had built a defensive system designed to defeat a conventional invasion. He was about to face something unprecedented. In the spring of 1944, Germany's strategic position was precarious in ways Hitler only partially acknowledged. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet offensive had pushed German forces back hundreds of miles. Army Group Center was under enormous pressure. The Crimea had been evacuated. Romania was wavering. Italy, after the Allied landings at Anzio and Salerno, was a grinding stalemate consuming divisions Germany needed elsewhere. And now, in the West, an invasion was coming. Everyone knew it was coming. The question was when and where. Hitler's military conferences in this period, recorded by stenographers, reveal a man caught between intuition and doctrine, between what he sensed and what his advisors told him. He would insist on certain defensive measures, then defer to his generals on others. He would question intelligence reports, then accept their conclusions. He was surrounded by experienced officers, men who had fought across Europe, who had studied warfare their entire careers. But their experience was shaped by previous wars, previous assumptions. None of them had faced an opponent with the industrial capacity and organizational sophistication the Allies now possessed. The Allied build-up in Britain had begun in earnest in 1943. After the Casablanca Conference, where Roosevelt and Churchill committed to a cross-channel invasion, the machinery of preparation began turning. American troops arrived by the hundreds of thousands. The 8th Air Force established bases across eastern England. Supply depots were built, ports were expanded, training grounds were established. By early 1944, southern England had become one vast military camp. Entire counties were restricted zones. Roads were clogged with convoys. The sky was filled with aircraft. And somehow, German intelligence was systematically misreading what this build-up meant. The ABWA reported that Allied forces were concentrated in southeastern England. This was partially true. There were genuine divisions there, genuine supplies, genuine activity. But the bulk of the invasion force, the actual assault divisions, were in the southwest, in Devon and Cornwall and Dorset, training for landings on beaches that looked nothing like Calais. The deception was layered, sophisticated, and entirely dependent on Germany believing what seemed most logical. The shortest route across the Channel was Calais. Therefore, the Allies would strike at Calais. Therefore, the build-up in southeastern England was the genuine invasion force. The logic was sound. The conclusion was wrong. Hitler, in his map room in May 1944, was beginning to sense this. Not with certainty, not with clear evidence, but with the kind of intuitive unease that had served him well in previous gambles and catastrophically in others. He looked at the number again. 2 million men. He looked at the map. He looked at his generals, who were certain of Calais, who had positioned forces accordingly, who were preparing to repel an invasion at the most obvious point. What if they don't come at Calais? He asked. Jodl responded carefully. All intelligence indicates Calais is the primary objective. The troop concentrations, the dummy installations Patton's army group, everything points to Calais. But what if that's exactly what they want us to believe? Hitler's voice rose slightly. What if this entire deception is designed to keep our strongest forces at Calais while they strike somewhere else? Then where, mein Führer? Jodl asked. Hitler's finger moved down the map to Normandy. Here, Cherbourg, a deep-water port they need for logistics. Beaches sheltered from the prevailing winds. Within range of fighter cover from England. He paused. If I were planning this invasion, if I had 2 million men and needed to establish a lodgment that couldn't be dislodged, I would strike here. The room went quiet. What Hitler had just described was exactly what the Allies were planning. But he didn't know that with certainty. It was intuition, a guess, one of many he had made throughout the war, some brilliant, some disastrous. His generals didn't know whether to trust it. And Hitler himself didn't know whether to override their professional judgment with his own hunches. So he compromised. He ordered additional defenses in Normandy. He shifted some divisions. But he kept the main strength at Calais. He prepared for 2 possibilities without fully committing to either. It was a rational decision. It was also exactly what the Allies needed him to do. On May 15, 1944, a SHAEF intelligence summary landed on Eisenhower's desk at his headquarters in southern England. It detailed German defensive positions across the Atlantic Wall and included an assessment of German awareness of Allied intentions. The summary concluded, enemy continues to expect assault in Pas-de-Calais sector. Normandy defenses being strengthened but remains secondary priority. Eisenhower read it and made a note in the margin. Continue fortitude. Maintain deception through D+30. The plan was working. Germany was divided, uncertain, preparing for the obvious while the actual blow assembled elsewhere. Back at the Berghof, Hitler was receiving similar intelligence from the opposite perspective. His staff brought reports of increased Allied activity in southwestern England. Reconnaissance flights when they penetrated British air defences showed more ships, more supplies, more troops than the Calais buildup could account for. But the ABWA's turned agents continued reporting that Patton's army group in the southeast was the main threat. The radio intercepts, fake but carefully crafted, suggested the same. Everything Germany's intelligence apparatus reported said Calais. Except the numbers didn't add up. 2 million men couldn't all be in southeastern England. The ports couldn't handle that concentration. The billeting couldn't support it. The logistics were impossible. Which meant they were somewhere else. Which meant either the Allies were incompetent at concentration, which seemed unlikely, or they were deliberately dispersing forces to obscure their actual point of assault. Hitler walked the grounds of the Berghof that evening, his German shepherd Blondie at his side, his mind working through the problem. He had built an empire on calculated risks, on striking where the enemy was weakest, on using deception and surprise. Now he faced an enemy employing the same methods against him. The question wasn't whether an invasion was coming. The question was whether Germany could identify it in time, concentrate forces fast enough, and destroy it before it established itself. And underlying that question was a deeper one he didn't fully articulate but sensed with growing certainty. Whether Germany, stretched across multiple fronts, bled by years of war, still possessed the strategic flexibility to respond to an operation of the scale the Allies were apparently planning. The sun set over the Alps. Hitler returned to his study. The intelligence folder lay on his desk, that number visible on the first page. 2 million men. Somewhere in Britain, an army larger than any Germany could now assemble was preparing to cross the Channel. And Hitler, standing in his mountain retreat, surrounded by maps and reports and the apparatus of command, was beginning to understand that regardless of where they landed, regardless of how well Germany responded, the sheer mass of what was coming might be unstoppable. Not because German soldiers weren't capable. Not because the Atlantic Wall wasn't formidable. But because the Allies had achieved something Germany, for all its early victories, had never managed. They had built an invasion force so large that even if Germany guessed correctly, even if every defensive plan worked perfectly, the numbers might simply overwhelm everything in their path. He sat down heavily in his chair. Outside, darkness settled over the mountains. Inside, the Führer of the Third Reich stared at an intelligence report and confronted a realization he would spend the next month trying to suppress. That the initiative, which Germany had held since 1939, had passed to the Allies. And that what was coming wasn't a battle Germany could win through superior tactics or better soldiers. It was a test of industrial capacity, of manpower reserves, of logistical endurance. And in every one of those measures, Germany was outmatched. The question wasn't whether the Allies would invade. The question was whether Germany could survive what happened after they did. The machinery of Operation Fortitude operated on a scale Hitler couldn't fully comprehend because he had never faced an opponent willing to commit such resources to deception alone. In southeastern England, opposite Calais, the British and Americans had constructed an entire phantom army. The 1st United States Army Group, supposedly commanded by General George Patton, existed as radio transmissions, dummy landing craft made of canvas and wood, fake supply dumps, and carefully leaked intelligence. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights, when they managed to penetrate British air defenses, photographed what appeared to be a massive buildup. Tanks lined up in fields, landing craft clustered in harbors, supply depots sprawling across the countryside. But the tanks were inflatable rubber, collapsing when touched. The landing craft were plywood frames covered with painted canvas. The supply dumps were empty crates stacked to look full from the air. And the radio traffic, supposedly coordinating a million-man army group, was generated by a few dozen operators sending scripted messages designed to be intercepted and decoded by German intelligence. It was theater on an unprecedented scale, and it worked because it told Germany what Germany already believed. Hitler received updates on Patton's army group throughout May. His intelligence summaries tracked its supposed movements, its order of battle, its preparation timeline. Everything suggested an invasion in late June or early July, targeting Pas-de-Calais. This aligned with German military doctrine about how invasions should be conducted. You concentrated forces at the narrowest crossing point. You established air superiority over the landing zone. You built up supplies for a rapid exploitation inland. The Allies, Germany's intelligence indicated, were following the textbook, which should have been the first warning that something was wrong. Meanwhile, in southwestern England, the actual invasion force trained in conditions of absolute secrecy. Entire coastal regions were sealed off. Troops practiced amphibious landings on beaches that resembled Normandy's coastline. Tank crews waterproofed their vehicles for deep wading. Engineers rehearsed clearing beach obstacles. Medics prepared for mass casualties. And overhead, Allied air forces flew thousands of sorties, not just bombing German positions in Normandy, but maintaining the deception by bombing Calais twice as heavily, ensuring German intelligence would interpret the bombing pattern as confirmation of where the assault would fall. The scale of coordination required was staggering. Eisenhower's SHAEF headquarters managed an operation involving 3 million people, 12,000 aircraft, 7,000 vessels, and supply chains stretching across the Atlantic. Nothing in military history compared to it. And the entire enterprise depended on one crucial element: that Germany wouldn't realize where the blow was coming until too late to concentrate forces effectively. On June 1, 1944, Hitler left the Berghof and traveled to Berchtesgaden for a meeting with his senior commanders. The invasion was imminent. Weather reports suggested a brief window of opportunity in early June. Rommel was in Germany, having left his headquarters in France to visit his wife for her birthday and then travel to the Berghof to request additional panzer divisions for the Normandy sector. He had become convinced, through his own analysis, that Normandy was a likely landing site. But he couldn't get Hitler to commit the armored reserves. The meeting was tense. Rommel argued for positioning panzers close to the coast. Von Rundstedt argued for keeping them inland as a mobile reserve. Hitler, caught between two experienced field marshals with opposing views, tried to split the difference. He gave Rommel some additional divisions for Normandy but kept the main armored strength under his own direct control, positioned to respond wherever the invasion materialized. It was a compromise that satisfied no one and would prove catastrophic. What Hitler didn't say in that meeting, what he was beginning to understand but couldn't articulate to his generals, was that the entire defensive strategy might be obsolete. The Atlantic Wall assumed Germany could identify the main invasion, concentrate forces, and counterattack within hours. But if the Allies came with overwhelming force at multiple points simultaneously, if they had achieved the kind of air superiority that would prevent German reinforcements from moving in daylight, if they possessed the logistical capacity to sustain an offensive faster than Germany could organize a defense, then all the concrete bunkers and beach obstacles in the world wouldn't matter. The battle would be decided not by tactical skill but by which side could bring more force to bear faster. June 5, 1944. Hitler was at the Berghof when weather reports indicated a storm moving across the English Channel. High winds, heavy seas, conditions that made amphibious operations impossible. His naval staff assessed that no invasion could occur for at least several days, possibly weeks. Rommel, confident in this assessment, left France to visit his wife. Many senior officers relaxed their alert status. The immediate crisis seemed to have passed. They were wrong. Allied meteorologists, reading the same weather patterns, had identified a brief window of marginally acceptable conditions on June 6. Eisenhower, facing enormous pressure to launch, made the decision. The invasion would proceed despite imperfect weather. At 2 a.m. on June 6, the first Allied paratroopers began dropping over Normandy. At 6:30 a.m., the first troops hit the beaches. Hitler was asleep. His staff, following his orders never to wake him except for genuine emergencies, waited. They received reports of parachute landings in Normandy, but initial assessments suggested this might be a diversion, a feint to draw German forces away from Calais where the real invasion would come. The standing orders were clear: do not commit the panzer reserves without the Führer's direct authorization. So the tanks sat motionless while on the Normandy beaches, Allied troops poured ashore. Hitler woke at his usual time, late morning. By then, the reports had clarified. This was no feint. This was a massive amphibious assault. 5 beaches, multiple divisions, thousands of ships. But was it the main invasion or a preliminary operation before the real assault at Calais? Hitler's first question, when briefed by Jodl, was exactly that. Is this the invasion or a diversion? It appears to be a major operation, mein Führer, Jodl replied carefully. But Patton's army group in southeastern England hasn't moved. Our intelligence suggests they're still preparing. Then this might be designed to draw our reserves to Normandy before the real assault comes at Calais. Hitler paced his study. We wait. We observe. We don't commit the panzers until we know with certainty. It was the doctrinally correct decision. It was what a cautious commander should do when facing possible deception. It was also exactly what Eisenhower needed. Every hour Hitler waited was an hour Allied troops used to push inland, to establish their lodgment, to bring more forces ashore. By the time Hitler made his decision, by the time he accepted that Normandy was the real invasion and Calais had been an elaborate deception, it would be too late. The Allies would be too strong, too well established, supported by air power that made daylight movement of German reserves almost impossible. But on the morning of June 6, Hitler didn't yet understand this. He studied the maps, listened to conflicting reports, and tried to determine if he was facing the real invasion or the most sophisticated feint in military history. The number from Krummeker's folder haunted him. 2 million men. If they were all in Britain, if this was the real assault, then the forces hitting Normandy represented perhaps a quarter to a third of Allied strength. Which meant more was coming. Which meant committing reserves to Normandy might leave Calais vulnerable to an even larger assault. Around the midpoint of this analysis, consider sharing this video with anyone interested in World War II decision-making. The full story reveals strategic miscalculation on a scale rarely seen in military history. The afternoon of June 6 brought more detailed reports. The Allies had established themselves on 5 beaches codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Casualties were heavy in some sectors, particularly Omaha, but nowhere had the invasion been thrown back into the sea. German defenders were fighting hard, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and without air cover. Luftwaffe pilots who attempted to attack the invasion fleet were swarmed by Allied fighters. Naval gunfire from battleships and cruisers was pulverizing German defensive positions. And still, the Panzer reserves sat inland, waiting for Hitler's authorization to move. Rommel, racing back from Germany, arrived at his headquarters at 10 p.m. on June 6. He immediately asked about the Panzers. Still held in reserve, his chief of staff reported. Berlin hasn't authorized their release. Rommel's face went white. They've been ashore for 16 hours. Every hour they dig in deeper. We needed to hit them at the waterline. We needed to attack in the first 6 hours. The Führer believes this might be a diversion. Rommel stared at the map. The scale of the landing was enormous. The number of ships, the intensity of naval gunfire, the commitment of airborne divisions, all of it suggested this was no diversion. This is the invasion, Rommel said quietly. And we've already lost the chance to destroy it. He was right. The critical period for counterattack was the first 24 hours, when Allied forces were most vulnerable, still establishing themselves, not yet fully supplied or reinforced. German doctrine called for immediate, overwhelming counterattack with armor. But Hitler had delayed authorization. And when he finally released the Panzers on June 7, they had to move in daylight, under skies controlled by Allied aircraft. The result was predictable. Tank columns were strafed, bombed, delayed. Bridges were destroyed. Roads were cratered. What should have been a 6-hour movement took 2 days. And by the time German armor reached the invasion zone, the Allies had established a perimeter too strong to break. Hitler, receiving these reports at the Berghof, began to understand the magnitude of what had occurred. The Allies hadn't just invaded. They had achieved surprise despite Germany knowing an invasion was coming. They had landed at a location Germany had considered but not prioritized. They had brought overwhelming force to bear faster than German doctrine assumed possible. And they had done it while maintaining a deception so effective that even as troops were fighting in Normandy, Hitler was still partially convinced the real invasion might yet come at Calais. On June 9, 3 days after the landing, intelligence reports confirmed what Hitler had feared and refused to accept. Patton's First United States Army Group was largely fictitious. The massive build-up in southeastern England was theatrical. The actual invasion force had been in southwestern England all along, and it was now ashore in Normandy and expanding its lodgment every hour. The number from May was being validated. 2 million men weren't coming at Calais. They were coming through Normandy. And Germany had positioned its strongest defenses in the wrong place. Hitler's response, when this reality became undeniable, was not dramatic. There was no explosion of rage, no theatrical denunciation of his intelligence services, no spectacular breakdown. Instead, according to officers present, he went very quiet. He sat at his map table, studying the Normandy sector, calculating distances and force ratios and logistical timelines. And then he said something his staff found chilling precisely because it was so matter-of-fact. They have more of everything than we do. More men, more tanks, more aircraft, more supplies. They can replace losses. We cannot. This invasion will succeed not because we fought poorly but because they brought resources we cannot match. It was an admission of a fundamental shift in the war. For years, Hitler had believed German tactical superiority could compensate for Allied industrial advantage. Better trained soldiers, better tactics, interior lines of defense, these would balance the scales. But Normandy demonstrated something different. The Allies had achieved tactical competence to match their industrial strength. They had planned meticulously, trained thoroughly, and executed an operation so complex that Germany, for all its military expertise, had been unable to counter it effectively. The realization aged him. Officers who saw Hitler in mid-June 1944 noted he looked older, moved more slowly, showed that tremor in his hand more frequently. The confident warlord who had gambled on France in 1941 was gone. In his place was a man confronting the consequences of strategic decisions made years earlier. The decision to declare war on America after Pearl Harbor. The decision to invade the Soviet Union before Britain was defeated. The decision to commit to a two-front war that Germany's industrial base couldn't sustain. By June 12, Allied forces had linked up their beachheads. By June 27, they had captured Cherbourg, giving them the deep-water port Hitler's intuition had identified as their objective back in May. By July, they were breaking out of the Normandy hedgerows. And all the while, Hitler maintained the fiction that a second invasion might still come at Calais. He kept the 15th Army there, Germany's strongest formation in the west, sitting in defensive positions while Normandy burned. Operation Fortitude's deception continued to work even after the invasion succeeded, paralyzing German responses for crucial weeks. What Hitler said in private during this period is documented in fragments. Albert Speer, his armaments minister, visited the Berghof in late June and found Hitler staring at production figures. "They built more aircraft last month than we built all year," Hitler said. "More tanks. More ships. More of everything. How do you fight an enemy who can replace losses faster than you can inflict them?" Speer had no answer. Germany's industrial production was being hammered by Allied bombing. Synthetic fuel plants were being destroyed. Transportation networks were breaking down. The Eastern Front was consuming divisions as fast as they could be formed. And now, in the West, a second front had opened that would drain resources Germany didn't have. Hitler's response to this reality evolved through several stages. Initially, denial. The invasion could still be contained. German troops would fight harder. Secret weapons would turn the tide. The V-1 rockets began falling on London in mid-June. Revenge weapons that killed civilians but had no military effect on the invasion. Then came bargaining. If Germany could just hold long enough, Allied resolve might crack. If the eastern and western enemies could be played against each other, some diplomatic solution might emerge. Then came depression, the dark moods where Hitler isolated himself, spoke of betrayal, blamed his generals for failures. But underneath these responses was something else. An understanding that the war, as Germany had fought it, was over. The blitzkrieg strategy of rapid conquest had failed when it hit the vastness of Russia and the industrial depth of America. Now Germany faced a grinding attritional war it couldn't win. The 2 million men in Britain were just the beginning. Behind them stood the resources of the American industrial system, churning out weapons and equipment at rates Germany couldn't match. Behind them stood the Soviet Union, pushing from the east with millions more men. Germany was caught in a vice, and it was closing. On July 20, 1944, a bomb planted by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg exploded in Hitler's conference room at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. Hitler survived, wounded but alive. The assassination attempt was part of a broader plot by German officers who recognized the war was lost and wanted to negotiate a peace before Germany was completely destroyed. The plot failed. Its leaders were executed, and Hitler emerged from it more convinced than ever that he was surrounded by traitors, that only his will kept Germany fighting. But in quiet moments, when the rage and paranoia subsided, the realization remained. The Allies had 2 million men in Britain in early June. By late summer, they had more than that in France. By autumn, they were approaching Germany's borders from the west while the Soviets closed in from the east. And there was nothing, no tactical brilliance, no wonder weapon, no force of will, that could stop what was coming. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Armed Forces High Command, was with Hitler in August when reports came of the Allied breakout from Normandy. American armored divisions were racing across France. Paris was about to fall. The Wehrmacht in the west was in headlong retreat. Keitel asked what orders should be given. Hitler looked at the map for a long moment. "We hold," he said finally. "Every city becomes a fortress. Every position is defended to the last man. We make them pay for every meter." It was the strategy of a man who knew he couldn't win but refused to surrender. Make the cost so high that perhaps, impossibly, the enemy would lose the will to continue. It didn't work. The Allies had committed too much, come too far, suffered too many casualties to stop short of total victory. And their industrial base could sustain losses that would have crippled Germany. When the Third Reich finally collapsed in May 1945, when Soviet troops raised their flag over the Reichstag and Hitler died by his own hand in his Berlin bunker, the invasion of Normandy was recognized as the beginning of the end. The moment when Allied material superiority, careful planning, and operational sophistication combined to breach Hitler's fortress Europe and begin the systematic destruction of the Nazi regime. But the psychological turning point, the moment when Hitler understood this outcome was inevitable, came earlier. It came in May 1944, in a map room in the Berghof, when he read that the Allies had 2 million men in Britain and realized he was facing not a desperate gamble but a methodical application of overwhelming force. It came in early June when those men landed not where Germany expected but where Germany was weakest. And it came in the weeks after, when every assessment, every calculation, every honest appraisal of relative strength led to the same conclusion. Germany had lost the initiative. The Allies had seized it. And the war that Germany had started with lightning victories and bold gambles was ending in slow, grinding, inevitable defeat. Historians have analyzed Hitler's decision-making extensively. Some blame his refusal to trust his generals. Some point to his strategic incompetence, his meddling in tactical decisions, his insistence on holding untenable positions. All of this is true. But underlying these failures was a more fundamental miscalculation. Hitler had assumed Germany could win through superior will, better soldiers, tactical brilliance. He had dismissed the importance of industrial capacity, of logistical depth, of the kind of methodical planning that characterized Allied operations. And when faced with an enemy who combined industrial strength with competent military execution, all his assumptions collapsed. The 2 million men in Britain represented something Hitler had never truly confronted. Not just numbers, but organization. Not just industrial output, but the systematic application of resources to military objectives. The Allies had spent 2 years preparing for D-Day. They had built specialized landing craft, trained assault divisions, accumulated supplies, established air superiority, cracked German codes, and constructed an elaborate deception. Every element was coordinated. Every contingency was planned for. It was war as engineering problem, solved through careful calculation rather than bold intuition. Hitler's style of leadership, his reliance on willpower and dramatic gestures, his belief that individual genius could overcome material disadvantage, had worked in the war's early years when Germany faced smaller, less prepared opponents. It failed utterly against the coalition that assembled against him. The Soviet Union's vast manpower and space, Britain's determination and global position, America's industrial power. Together, they represented resources Germany simply couldn't match. And Normandy was where that reality became undeniable. In the final months of the war, as Germany collapsed, officers who had served with Hitler noted his increasing detachment from reality. He moved phantom divisions on maps, ordered counterattacks by units that no longer existed, spoke of victories that had no basis in fact. But there had been a moment, they said, in mid-1944, when he had been brutally honest about Germany's position. When he had looked at the numbers, assessed the situation clearly, and understood what was coming, that moment passed. The delusions returned. But for a brief period, Hitler confronted the truth he had avoided since declaring war on America and invading Russia. That he had started a war Germany couldn't win. And that the 2 million men assembling in Britain were proof of that terrible miscalculation. The legacy of that realization shaped everything that followed. Hitler's refusal to allow retreats, his insistence on holding every position, his willingness to see German cities reduced to rubble rather than surrender, all stemmed from knowing the war was lost but being unable to accept the consequences. If you couldn't win, you made the enemy's victory as costly as possible. If defeat was inevitable, you delayed it as long as possible. If the Third Reich was doomed, you took as much of Europe down with it as you could. This was the psychological state that characterized Hitler's final year. Not delusional about ultimate victory, though he maintained that fiction for public consumption, but grimly, bitterly committed to fighting because the alternative, surrender and accountability, was unthinkable. The man who had built his political career on will and determination applied those same qualities to prolonging a war he knew was lost. And millions died in that prolonging, in the desperate battles of 1944 and 45, in the cities bombed to ash, in the camps where genocide continued until Soviet and American troops arrived to stop it. On April 30, 1945, with Soviet troops blocks away from his bunker, Hitler wrote his political testament. In it, he blamed everyone but himself. The generals who had betrayed him. The German people who had proven unworthy of his vision. The Jewish conspiracy he imagined controlled his enemies. But nowhere in that document did he acknowledge the fundamental truth that any honest accounting would have revealed. That Germany had fought a coalition with greater resources, better planning, and eventually, comparable military skill. That the invasion of Normandy had succeeded because the Allies had learned from their mistakes, built an unprecedented force, and executed a plan that German defenses, for all their strength, couldn't stop. That the 2 million men he had learned about in May 1944 were just the visible tip of an industrial and military machine that Germany, weakened by years of war and stretched across multiple fronts, had no capacity to defeat. If you've stayed with this story to the end, consider subscribing. History offers lessons about the consequences of strategic miscalculation, and understanding those lessons matters more than we might think. The silence that officers described in Hitler's map room in June 1944, when he finally accepted that Normandy was the real invasion and Calais had been a deception, echoed the silence Captain Aoki described at Midway. That moment when assumptions collapse, when the reality you've been avoiding becomes undeniable, when you understand that the war you thought you were winning has just turned irrevocably against you. Not a dramatic pronouncement. Not a theatrical gesture. Just a quiet, terrible recognition that everything you believed about your position, your advantage, your inevitable victory, was wrong. And in Hitler's case, that recognition came too late to change course, too late to seek peace, too late to do anything but fight on toward a defeat that had become inevitable the moment Allied planners began calculating how many men would be needed to breach the Atlantic Wall and decided 2 million was the answer.